If you feel like you're easily distracted and you're not spending time doing the things you want to do, then keep watching, because in this video, I'm going to give you a framework for becoming more conscious as an individual and, as a result, less distracted in as little as 12 weeks. Now, here's the thing. You might be saying to yourself that you're not bad with distractions, but I'd encourage you to question that, because I feel we all shy away from this topic to a degree because it's hard to deal with. It's a daily struggle for most people to wake up and do the things we want to do, and over time that leaves us in a place where we kind of just go through the motions with what we do. Just moving our body for the sake of moving it and ticking a box, not really spending as much time as we should with other people, not really utilizing our free time as much as we should. We can start to feel like zombies, where there's just a general dullness about the things we do and nothing really gives us energy and life anymore. When you actually start to unpack these things, these are the areas of life we want to resolve. We want to feel excited about our day. We want to feel energized by the things we do, the people we choose to spend our time with, and ultimately feel like there's a richness and fullness to our experience. We've all probably felt this alignment at some point in our life before, where all aspects of what we do just seem to positively impact each other. There's a feeling of a spiraling up. You feel like you're on the right path, and taking action just feels like the natural thing to do. So what's going on here? What's leading us to feel somewhat numb and dull when it comes to the things we do? If you're wondering who I am to talk about this topic, then let me introduce myself. My name is Ronan Lewins. I'm a movement teacher. I'm running a movement school here in Bray, and I have students working with me online as well. Over the years, my work with my students has always highlighted the real areas of their life that are limiting them in their development. It's often not as simple as just go and do this training program. More often than not, we really have to unpack the layers of who we are, where we want to go with our lives, and what we're actually doing on a day-to-day basis. And what I find with my students is that there's often some form of misalignment in those areas. I think the majority of us really struggle to understand who we are on a deeper level, so we don't really know what we want. We kind of just get pulled towards shiny objects and quick pleasures. If you really zoom out and see your habits on a day-to-day basis, you start to notice that. It can be really tough to be confronted with that, and my objective really is to guide my students in the best way possible so that all areas of their life start to bounce off each other way more and they get a deeper feeling of contentment. This kind of holistic approach is really what allows for results like Jen had. She was really struggling to practice on a consistent basis, and she had lost her love of training. When we started unpacking some of these things, helping her identify some of the things she was doing that weren't helping her, and then aligning her goals with a deeper purpose, she wasn't battling herself every day to go and practice anymore. She was loving the process again. So in today's video, we're going to be covering one of the key pillars and frameworks I teach to help my students with becoming more conscious and less distracted. To get an understanding of this, we have to really analyze the problem and piece the puzzle together as to why we all struggle to become more conscious in the first place. So where I wanted to start with this is a problem we all seem to be facing in this modern landscape, and that is something called the war of attention. Maybe you've heard of this before. To get a better understanding of this, we have to think of things from an evolutionary perspective. You know, for thousands upon thousands of years, we as Homo sapiens have lived in a very different environment. We have adapted evolutionarily to a very different environment. So our genes, our makeup is all really optimized for what would be considered more of a natural environment, if you get my meaning. So I mean out in nature, moving, like we are hunter-gatherers by nature. And I'm not just saying that obviously the progress into agriculture and the Industrial Revolution is wrong. I'm just saying that the majority of our genes, our DNA, is all optimized for a completely different environment. We found ourselves very active out in nature, really in the natural rhythm of things. When really, you look at the landscape we find ourselves in now, it is very, very different for the majority of us. We find ourselves way more sedentary than we were previously. That has its impacts. And we're also looking at screens. That's a huge thing. Like, the war of attention is really to do with how connected we all are in terms of the internet, in terms of media. And we are being distracted on a constant basis because we didn't really evolve in an environment this chaotic, this hectic, this filled with distractions. Like, this has happened in a very short space of time when you think about it from an evolutionary perspective. And as a result, there hasn't really been an ability for us to adapt as quickly. It's happened in such a short space of time, and we're still kind of working off of what would be considered more ancient DNA. We never really had anything in our environment that would, entertain us for so long, that would really distract us for these extended periods. Because, like, when you think about it, if you were distracted for an extended period of time, there were dangers around, obviously, when you think about it that far back. But there were things that we had to do. There were things that we had to do to keep up our livelihood. Whereas now we obviously find ourselves in a very different circumstance. For a lot of us, we don't have to necessarily, if we miss a day or two, it's not going to be the end of the world. But it's certainly something to consider in terms of, say, the gap that's then created in terms of our need for survival, and this ability for us to kind of get lost in very kind of short-term things, feel those rush of neurochemicals come and get pleasure from something that isn't necessarily something that is giving us life or helping us prosper in any way. The way we used to operate, which was anytime we would kind of feel these rush of neurochemicals, was always down to something that was very motivationally charged. Like it was either something in the negative sense, something that we were trying to get away from, that we were trying to protect ourselves, or then motivating us in terms of pleasures towards doing something that was going to be helpful for our survival. You think of the likes of love, bonding, all of those different things. Those were a rush of chemicals in the positive sense. So we obviously find ourselves in a very different landscape now. You consider some of the companies like Facebook, Google, Netflix. These companies have a lot of money that they're spending all towards this optimization. That optimization being getting you to spend more time on their platforms, consuming media and consuming ads as a result. That's how they're getting a lot of their revenue. And they are hiring very smart engineers who understand the makeup of our kind of ancient brain and how easy it is to manipulate to a degree. We're being fed this kind of artificial form of dopamine, and as a result, we're staying on the platform. It's very, I say easy, it's easy for them in the sense that they have these massive data sets. They can understand kind of trends at large scales, and they can adjust an algorithm to make these kind of big shifts, keeping you on for longer. And kind of gradually we've seen that develop over time to the point that we all feel like we have an issue with our media consumption. We're all binge watching Netflix. We're all kind of seeking out lots of information, even though we probably don't need to. We're kind of finding that a little bit harder to manage. And then certainly when it comes to social media, we find ourselves just doom scrolling for ages, when really we know we shouldn't be. We should be off doing something that is at least a little bit more beneficial, something that isn't such a distraction of our time. So one of the things I'm pointing to here is that you really can't deny how seriously unequipped we are for this environment that we find ourselves in because of that rapid change. They're able to change these things so quickly, and we, in terms of our ability to change, it's at a much larger scale. It's much slower in terms of evolution. So if this is the environment we find ourselves in, then what's the result of all this? How does this make us feel? It's easy to point to this as a standalone thing and just say, okay, we're all spending too much time watching TV and scrolling our phones, and that's fair. It's the easiest thing to highlight. But we have to consider this as something that affects our overall system and has downstream effects. There's more and more data coming out about the negative impacts we're all experiencing as a result of the amount of media we're exposed to. Easiest way I can show you this is to contrast the two and tell you first about what I'm going to call distracted living, where we experience all those negative things I talked about earlier. Each one of these things is having a relationship with the other and impacting the other in very subtle ways. So one of the ways this is having an impact on us all is this idea of craving forms of instant gratification. So you imagine when you are bored at any stage throughout the day, it's a habit for a lot of people to suddenly take out their phone. That could be obviously, you're going to the toilet. A lot of people scroll the phone when they're on the toilet seat. You think about it when there's like a lull in anything, people are taking out their phones. You've got kind of like 2 minutes to spare. You're waiting around for someone. People take out their phones and they scroll apps and they do various things. And this is all that kind of reward-seeking behavior that the brain is going through. It thinks, okay, boredom, nothing is happening. I can very quickly get a little hit of dopamine. I know we're not kind of thinking through it that consciously, but the brain is really seeking out these pathways towards things that have been shown to be rewarding in the past. So we've got to consider that because it really leads to effects down the line. It's almost kind of like the starting domino where if we're doing this from the moment we wake up to the moment we go to bed, or if we're doing this over a long-term scale, weeks, months, and potentially even years, you can imagine how that then has an impact down the line. So for a lot of people, we kind of experience this feeling of like drained vitality or feelings of emptiness where, we're not necessarily getting much from the things that we're doing because we don't really have much life to us. We're not getting the rewards that we would typically get from the things that we're doing because we're getting the rewards from something else. So the kind of the neurochemicals that are going around in the brain are kind of in this weird sort of mix as a result of always seeking out our positive feelings and sensations from something that's kind of cheap, that's immediately rewarding. But when we need to invest a lot of our time and energy into something that's going to take a little bit of time, like if you've ever heard of the marshmallow test, this idea of delayed gratification, you know, you have that sense of drained vitality because you're always seeking out these reward-based, these instant gratification forms of reward. You know, over time, it's kind of associated with feelings of like brain fog or feeling scattered, just unable to really concentrate on what would even be considered more simple tasks. Like I know I mentioned there this idea of feeling like you can't concentrate on difficult tasks, but there's even that sort of messiness, brain fog that leads us to find it difficult to just execute even very basic, simple things. You can imagine some of the other effects that's having kind of downstream. You can imagine feeling anxious, feeling restless. That's even down to sort of the sedentary lifestyle that we find ourselves in. We're not really using our body in the way that we used to, so we feel somewhat restless, somewhat amped up, like we need to go and do something, but then we're even consuming media that is potentially making us feel very emotive, feeling very stressed as a result. You know, you consume something that is stress inducing, like that's felt in the body. You kind of combine the two. It's not a nice feeling. It's that feeling of kind of being overstimulated in a way. It's as I said, it's not directly as a result of the thing, but you can imagine how it permeates out into these feelings that can start to show up in the body when it's over a long-term period. For a lot of us, we struggle with these forms of media late at night, where it's kind of our free time and we find ourselves looking at a screen. There's lots of blue light coming in. So for the majority of us, it has that knock-on effect of feeling sleep deprived. You know, you're not able to stop binging those forms of media. We have our phone in front of our face right before we go to bed, so it's leading us to have, you know, we're having less sleep and poorer sleep as a result. And now we're certainly getting into things that would be considered more like downstream causes or downstream effects of all this, all of these things that we're doing, these kind of behaviors, these feelings. Like if you zoom out far enough, you'll start to realize that there's a certain level of emotional disconnection that can start to happen. There's feelings of isolation. And even though you're somewhat connected in a way, you're not really connected in the more natural sense, like actually seeing a person in front of you, feeling part of a community, all those different things. You know, if we let this take hold for long enough, and I think we've all maybe felt this at one point in time where it's just taken over a little bit too much, we feel like there's some form of wasted potential. You know, we're not getting as much as we should out of the things that we're doing. We're not receiving as much reward from our kind of natural life goals, our objectives, all that sort of stuff. And we start to feel as if there's some form of wasted potential, like I should be putting much more effort into this and I should be doing better in some way. And you know, as I said, it's the rolling effect that this starts to have in terms of those general feelings of like numbness towards life, like you're just not getting anything from life. And it's a horrible place to be in. And as I said, we've maybe all felt it to some degree, maybe not all of us, but I'd say the majority of us have to a small degree. And then there's probably another percentage of us that have really felt this to a large extent. But with all that being said, there is an alternative. I talked about the spiraling up feeling a little earlier, and it's created when you have a positive feedback loop in multiple areas of your life all working together. Like when we think about everything I just mentioned in terms of the negative impacts of distracted living, that was kind of a negative feedback loop. You know, one thing is kind of having a little bit of an impact on the other, and it's just kind of leading to that spiraling down sensation where if you let that kind of take over for a long enough period, it feels like it's kind of pulling you down to a degree. You're not really doing many things. There's stress, there's negative emotions, there's all these things that are kind of knocking into each other and having that bad effect as a result of everything kind of interacting with each other. So when we think about it in the positive sense, we can think about this in a twofold way, where we both abstain from the things that are causing the problems we're experiencing and then replace it with actions that build momentum over time to the point that the positive feedback loops start to kick in. We expect to feel those positive impacts straight away from these things, but to be honest with you, the first few weeks are always a bit of a grind. There's a lot of resistance because you're taking away all of the things your brain and body has habitually adapted to in order to get good chemicals. Like when you think about it, you have these sort of immediate sources that you can go to all the time for a quick little bit of pleasure. And when you take that stuff away, you're kind of left in this period of dullness, monotony, boredom. You know, it's nothing to be concerned about, but it's the idea that we're aware that we're feeling disconnected from reality because we're seeking these instant pleasures almost all the time. And we know that if we're able to cut the ties, if we're to think about things from a more long-term scale and start to implement things that we know are going to help us feel more content over the long term, it makes that sacrifice worthwhile. So you need to be aware of this. Abstaining is basically going to look like just reducing back on all the forms of entertainment and media that you're consuming. So you're pretty much not consuming any forms of social media. You're really trying to question your relationship with your phone. You're trying to limit back maybe the amount of time that you watch TV. And I know I've kind of pointed to those few things and they might seem like the obvious ones, but you potentially have one that you're always going to for a form of instant gratification. But you've got to think about it as like, how can I reduce back on those things that are just distracting me, if that's the easiest way to think of it. And something that you can think about then potentially using as a replacement is just something like reading. You know, while we want to make sure that we're maybe filling up our time with things that we know are going to do as well, like moving and activity and stuff like that, there's just going to be a certain point where, you know, we've kind of exhausted those things and there's just time that's free. And we all have that, and that's a healthy thing to have. But something like reading is just going to be at least another replacement where it's not so, you know, it's not so stimulating. It's something that you really need to engage your brain in for a little bit. And something that you really need to concentrate on. You know, there's healthy aspects of reading that start to take play or take shape, whereas you can imagine these kind of more high stimulating, varied forms of media, like where you're scrolling and you're seeing a million different things, all different to each other. They can become a little bit more of an issue over time when it comes to concentration, attention span, all those kind of things. Now, if you've come across my channel before, you've probably heard me talk about something called an anti-vision. So this is the idea of setting up, going through a list of questions, setting yourself up and understanding that there's a vision that you have, but there's also something that you need to be aware of called your anti-vision. You need to be aware of the place or the reality, something that a place you could find yourself in if you were to let all your bad habits run amok, take hold, potentially in the way that they are right now. You know, for a lot of us, it's maybe a case of if we point to it and we recognize it, we start to realize potentially with where we are now that we're not too far off that, and that can be quite a jarring experience for some of us. You know, it's not an easy thing to become aware of, but sometimes we do need to be confronted with that reality that, like, oh yeah, I'm in a bad place right now. I'm not as bad as I could be, you know, but potentially I am on the decline. I am, if a few things were to go bad, I would really find myself in a bad place. And it may seem very harsh, but there's actually a lot of evidence to suggest that this is a really beneficial exercise for people to go through, having the two contrasted, because it's very motivating. We can point to that and say, okay, this is the thing that I don't want. It makes things very real. It really brings things to your conscious awareness. So when you're thinking about motivating yourself going forward, that kind of sits at the back of your head, thinking that, like, yes, we're doing this for the right reasons, and we're also trying to get away from that thing, that reality that we know is potentially around the corner if we continue the way we continue. When this is clear and you have some rigid boundaries, the next phase is adding in practices that will help you develop more of an awareness of self. I actually teach this in the initial phase of my work with my students, where we have various pieces that build one on top of the other. So I call this the conscious body. The idea here is that we are looking more towards the internal self. Like when you think about a movement practice, you might think about things on the external. We think about the physical change that we go through. But it's just as important to look at things and do protocols and exercises to help us from an internal perspective. Like we can think of something easy to point out would maybe be something like meditation. Now, there are various forms, they all have different objectives, and we can use those things in different ways to help us become more conscious of our thoughts, if that's the objective, help us connect to the feelings and sensations, like emotions that we go through. So there's various forms of meditation, and they can help us in various different ways. But you can imagine the objective to a degree is to become more conscious of the things that we go through, who we are as an individual. When we think of something like the sedentary lifestyle that we find ourselves in as well, we can think of more gentle or daily movement practices that we can go through as well. For a lot of us, this is a big area of concern because we find ourselves only really doing a lot of movements that are like pushing ourselves, capacity based stuff where it's all go, go, go. And when you introduce something that's maybe a little bit more about developing more softness, developing more range of motion, learning how to integrate and see the body as more of a connected piece, these practices can be very, very valuable in terms of bringing a sense of lightness and ease to the body, as opposed to that maybe kind of stiff, tensed up, always on feeling that the body might have. Think of this as different breathing protocols, various lifestyle things, like you go through things like habit tracking, things to kind of organize your day. Like these are equally valuable in terms of the internal practices as maybe some of the things like meditation. Like as I said, this is about becoming more conscious. So when we start to track our habits, we start to realize the places that we're maybe spending a lot of our time. And I give this in various forms for my students, depending on what they currently are doing. And I kind of point them in the right direction based off these various things that we play around with. It might not be a case that we're doing these things all the time, but really based on the conversations that I'm having with them, the areas that they need to address, we can bring in these things for a period of time to really make us more, to just shine the light on an aspect of our life that maybe needs some adjustment. And, as I said earlier, we may look at these things and say like, oh, no, I'm fine in this area. And then it's suddenly we put a spotlight on it and we go like, oh, wow, this is really having a huge impact outward in the whole system. And I need to be aware of that, and I need to know then what to adjust. And we're only going to get there by maybe tracking some of these things and understanding our lifestyle a little bit better. We can go through various things like writing tasks, using that as a form of kind of thinking more clearly, really making sense of what is the internal environment that can be a little bit messy in terms of our thoughts. We might think internally that we're going through this very kind of structured way of thinking, but we suddenly start to recognize through writing tasks how disconnected our thinking is. Maybe that we haven't got something fully formed that we really identify with, that we need to investigate further. And it's only when we then bring that into reality, we start to realize its impact that it's having on us, maybe some limiting beliefs, all of those different things. They really point us in the right direction in terms of becoming more conscious and aware. We can go through a process of self-observation, like really trying to take a step back through the things that we're doing. We're still taking action throughout the day, but we're maybe observing ourselves a little bit more to understand how we're reacting to certain scenarios, how we're going about our day. And as I said, it's when you start to approach things from these different angles, we start to get a new perspective, and then we can look to change things. We can look to, like I talk about this in the way that we can learn how to program ourselves. Like we can make changes in these areas. And as I said, it's a positive feedback loop. They all start to feed off of each other, and they start having that huge impact outward. If we do them consistently for long enough, and we approach things in the right way, like I obviously make things very personal for my students. So that's where we can really start to see the effect that these things are having when we introduce these various lifestyle protocols, these internal practices. Now, everything that I've just mentioned there, it might seem like a lot of things to go and adjust, but this is the thing. We hear about all of those different things and we go like, wow, that's so many things to suddenly start doing. But you've got to remember the idea that we've pulled back on a lot of the things that we were doing that were distracting us, and we need to fill our time. So when we find ourselves with that extra bit of time that we've suddenly been able to carve out, and enough motivation to know that we need to go and change these things, as I said, I mentioned the anti-vision, we suddenly see taking on maybe one or two of these things as not such a bad idea. When we do pull back and we start to get positive reinforcement, like positive emotions and feelings associated with those things, it becomes more of a like, oh yeah, I do want to see myself maybe continuing with this. And slowly but surely, in a more systemized and easy to follow way, we can start to implement more and more of these things. So don't think by me saying all of that stuff that it's like, cool, from day one you have to go and do all of this. You obviously don't want it to be overwhelming at the start. That's why this is over a 12-week period, remember. So each one is kind of in there so that it's not too much of an ask, and it's very doable, it's very manageable. That's the important thing. So as I said, in the same way we talked about the negative feedback loop that gets created with distracted living, when you build these in piece by piece, layer by layer, they start to create a positive feedback loop in all areas of your life. So instead of craving things like instant forms of gratification, we talked about things like social media, things like Netflix, all that sort of stuff, you actually start craving and really appreciating more wholesome experiences. Think of these things that actually make you feel, feel good, feel content, feel wholesome. Like, you think about things like going for a hike, being out in nature. When you feel connected to those things, they are a very enriching experience. Think of things like having a deep conversation with a friend. Like, you can get lost in a conversation when you're really engaged in it. When it kind of goes down these different avenues, you start to learn about yourself, you start to learn about the other person, you start to piece together different ideas, all of these different things that, like, those can be very meaningful experiences for a lot of people. You can think of things like petting a dog. Like, these things all become way more fulfilling and enriching when we find ourselves in a place that we're not actually like craving very short form things. We're very distracted. I think we've all found ourselves probably like, in the middle of a conversation with someone, and we're distracted by looking at something, and then we're like, I'm not even here. I'm not even engaged. I'm not really giving this person my full energy because I'm just everywhere. I'm all over the place. But when we do find ourselves very content, very fulfilled, very enriched, we're able to get much more out of the simple things that we're doing on a very regular basis. And we actually then start craving those things. We thought about it earlier as this kind of sense of, drained vitality, feeling like we're a bit empty. Instead of that, you have, you start feeling like you have boundless energy. You start feeling like you have a vitality for life. I mean, think about the idea of waking up in the morning. For a lot of people, it can be it's a bit of a dread. For a lot of people, it's a case of just immediately going to the phone and putting it right in front of your face, as opposed to, feeling like, I want to go out there. I want my day to take shape. I want to be active in life. I want to really go out there and do what I'm doing and like what I'm doing in a way. Not only like what I'm doing, but love what I'm doing. Instead of feeling scattered and experiencing brain fog all the time, feeling like you're unable to concentrate, you have clear, unwavering focus and attention towards your goals. That's a really, really important thing too, because I know for a lot of us, we kind of have this feeling of, I have things that I want to work on, but, I get distracted to the point that, I set out a target and then I come back to it almost like 2 weeks later and I've completely forgot about it. And it's not that I didn't have the best intentions. It's just, I didn't really set up any system. I didn't really maybe plan things out, or, as I said, distractions just took over. So when you find yourself more distraction free, you have this kind of clear agenda. You know the things that you need to do. You know the responsibilities that you have that you need to execute on, like family responsibilities, work responsibilities. You understand the different areas and the positive impact they're having. So you're kind of thinking like, no, I need to get this in. Things start to become way more of a priority to you, whereas beforehand you maybe would have craved those kind of things that maybe were just your default going towards. You're always kind of just spending your evening at home, and suddenly it's like, oh, I have to go and do something else. Oh, I might as well just stay home. Whereas now you're like, no, I want that thing. I want to go and do that thing that I'd always been pushing off because I was always so distracted. And I was always kind of feeling like a little bit, feeling as if there wasn't as much that I was getting from that stuff. As I said, I pointed to it previously with the distracted living. It was this feeling of kind of emptiness. When that's not there, you start to get more from the things that you're doing. It's a cycle. It's a positive feedback loop that you're getting, because you've now kind of programmed yourself in a way to get all your good feels from the things that you're doing, those things that you know are good for you. You can imagine those feelings of anxiety we talked about, feeling stressed, all that sort of stuff. That really changes. That will change towards feeling more calm, feeling more centered, feeling more present with the things that you're doing. Even though, it's not as if life stresses don't continue, we just maybe see them from a different perspective. We start to challenge them a little bit more. Maybe we start to challenge our response to those things. Like, as I said, these forms of meditation, this idea of distancing ourselves from our reactivity, we start to see them as a little bit more of a like, oh, I have a bit of a choice here. It's not as simple as thing A happens, thing B is the response. There's distance to be able to go like, this is a little bit of an annoyance. I'm aware of that, but I don't have to let myself be pulled in this direction for it to have a chain reaction down the line. Like, that's really this ability to observe, to see things from a new perspective that can be really, really valuable for a lot of people, because we just don't question that. We just go into a default pattern. We just go one thing into the next. And that's where we find ourselves in these kind of loops of like, what am I doing? Why am I here? What are the things that I've that have led me to this point. And I think when you have the perspective shift, you start to feel it in different ways in your life. Like maybe you've really confronted something recently that you've been doing for a long period of time, and you're like, this needs to change. Like, what am I doing that's leading from this to this to this? And you feel a shift, you make a realization, you have an insight, and suddenly you're like, whoa, I'm seeing this from a different perspective now that I just couldn't see it at the time. It was just, things were messy, I was in it too much, and it's only this zoomed out perspective that I'm able to really see it in full now, recognize something about it, and now I can actually set something up so that I don't go into that default pattern, or I make a big change, whatever it might be. And that comes from this ability to extract yourself from the situation, to be able to be a little bit more calm, to understand yourself more, and understand yourself to the point that you can start to see like, nope, this is not valuable for me. This is something that's going to pull me away from the things that I want, that I know that are going to be good for me, and this is only going to pull me towards the negative. But that's hard for people to see when you're in the mess. I talked about it previously with this feeling of being maybe like overstimulated, being sleep deprived, binging on different things. Instead of that, you really crave things that are more restful, things that maybe lead towards a greater sense of relaxation in your life. Sleep doesn't necessarily need to be something that you push off all the time. Sleep is actually something that you're like, no, I want to get a good night's sleep. I want to get a restorative night's sleep because I know the impact that it's going to have on me tomorrow. You crave more like calming, less stimulating activities, all this sort of stuff that are going to be good for your nervous system. Do you know what I mean? Like if we're so amped up all the time, and we're not aware of that, if we suddenly find ourselves getting a nice contrast, as I said, we bring ourselves into forms of meditation, we extract ourselves from all these things, we have a nice gap between everything now. So as opposed to feeling so upregulated all the time, we're bringing our baseline down to being kind of like more in the middle. And then it's kind of like, I really have a nice affinity or a connection to those kind of down-regulating things. They actually feel really good, and they have a nice positive impact on me and my mood. So then it becomes a case of, actually, I want to do more of those things. I actually want to have more of that stuff there because of how calm and relaxed it makes me feel. I talked about it earlier as well, this idea of the negative feedback loop that we find ourselves in leads to these kind of more downstream things that aren't maybe as direct, but things like, feeling emotional disconnection or feeling isolated as a result of distracted living. You can imagine now with more conscious living, you actually start to feel more connected to others. You actually start to feel a sense of belonging in the relationships that you have. Like that is for sure something that starts to happen because you're more engaged with others. You're asking better questions. You're really empathizing with everyone that you're interacting with. So you maybe see someone, from a different perspective because you haven't just gone into reactivity every time that you've interacted with them. Whether it's we maybe point to things like family relationships. It's very easy for us to get sucked in because it's a relationship that we've had for such a long period of time, and these kind of default patterns that we have with the certain people that we interact with. We maybe see things from a different perspective, and we're like, no, I'm gonna do something different now. I'm actually going to change the course that I always go down. And as a result, that can change things up. It can lead to very interesting interactions with people that you've maybe had a relationship for a very long period of time. You can imagine then how that impacts the relationships you have with people that you maybe see for the first time. New people that you meet, you're a lot more open to them as opposed to closed off and being like, yeah, cool, whatever. You build a deeper connection almost from the start, and those can be very interesting interactions to have, and you can imagine how that makes you feel more connected with everyone around you, to being a human. I understand it's not a case of like it's all very simple to just get those things straight away. You have to imagine there's a little bit of work that needs to go in place, but as we talked about it with a negative loop, it's easily and equally available to us that we can find ourselves in very positive loops when we feel we're living more consciously. We're feeling like we're living a life with more meaning, more purpose, more fulfillment. So the thing to be aware of is that this is all possible in as short as 12 weeks. You can honestly flip and change how you're feeling, what you know about yourself, and create an incredible platform for change and growth in as little as 12 weeks. Now, this is the whole objective of the Movement Practice Foundation's intensive. I see the idea of a 12-week intensive as a really great way to set the stage for starting off for most people. So many people will kind of half-ass starting something like this. They don't really have a clear outcome. They don't really look at things in a systemized way. They don't consider all of these layers and more. And they can all be executed easily when it's actually laid out in front of you as a step-by-step process. The idea is you need clear guidelines and then there's no confusion as to the actions that matter and are actually going to make a difference. You're not spinning your wheels for months and months making no progress. As I said, my conscious body material is just one area of my work. There's another 3 pillars as part of the Movement Practice Foundations Intensive. So if you want me to explain the intensive in full and what's expected of you over the 12-week period, then head to the link below this video and I can send you on some more details. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to the page if you haven't done so already, and I'll see you on the next one, folks.